And we're back. So today we're going to be talking about Barnes and Nobles because they made a cool announcement back in 2025 that they're going to be opening, I don't know, 60 new stores in 2026. So let's go into the screen share and see what's been happening with that. So screen share, everybody loves the sharing. Share, share, share. The power of share. All right, I think we're where we need to be. Looks like we are. So, for years, the story of the physical bookstore sounded like an obituary being written in slow motion. Amazon took over online book sales, major chains closed hundreds of locations, Borders disappeared entirely. Y'all remember Borders? I do. And Barnes& and Noble spent more than a decade shrinking, retreating, and occasionally looking like it might become the world's largest candle and journal store, but also carried a respectable number of books. I don't like candles. Please stop doing that. Then something unexpected happened. Barnes& and Noble started opening stores again. A lot of them. Um, at the end of 2025, the company announced plans to open at least 60 bookstores during 2026. That is more than one new Barnes& and Nobles every week. Apparently, while much of retail was trying to convince us that the future involved ordering everything through an app and never speaking to another human being, Barnes and Noble decided America needed more places where people could wander around holding one book for 25 minutes before buying three completely different new ones. And a special note on that non-humans. Now we have robots, because we used to be able to hit chat and maybe talk to some guy in another country. Now we don't even got that. All right. Minor quips aside, moving on. Um, Today I want to answer basically four questions. What exactly did Barnes and Noble's promise? How many stores has it opened so far? And what could this expansion mean for independently owned new and used bookstores? And with less than half the year remaining, is Barnes and Noble's actually going to reach 60 openings by December 31st? Um, The announcement began basically circulating nationally in December 2025. Barnes& and Noble said it planned to open around 60 stores during 2026, both in new markets and in communities where the company had previously operated. At that point, it had already secured leases in California, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Ohio, Texas. Yeah, Texas. Everybody, that's just me, I know. Virginia, Washington State, and Washington, D.C. So this was not merely an executive saying, we would love to open some bookstores someday. The leases had been signed. Properties had been identified. Somebody had probably already started arguing about where to put the cafe and whether the big biography section needed to move 6 feet to the left. Um, the count has kind of been reconstructed. So basically, Barnes& and Noble's not released a complete public list of all 60 locations or a detailed month-by-month opening schedule. That missing master list matters because Barnes& and Noble's is privately owned. It does not publish the same financial reports, construction schedules, and investor updates we might receive from a publicly traded retailer. Most of what we know has to be assembled from individual grand opening announcements, local news reports, shopping center landlords, store locator pages, construction notices, and interviews with the CEO, James Daunt. Tracking the expansion is therefore less like reading a corporate report and more like assembling a bookshelf without the instructions. You could probably finish it, but one shelf may lean slightly and there will be like three screws left over. The wording of the target has also varied. Some reports described exactly 60 stores. Barnes& and Noble's own announcements has used phrases such as 60, at least 60, and more than 60. So I would not interpret this as a sacred promise to finish with precisely 60. Nobody at headquarters is likely to reach store number 60 in December and yell, "Stop construction! The prophecy has been fulfilled." Um, it's going to be more like the practical goal appears to be somewhere around 60 openings, with the possibility of exceeding that number. While that sounds ambitious, it was not completely unrealistic. Barnes& Nobles has already opened more than 60 stores during 2025, following 57 openings in 2024. The company ended 2025 with approximately 702 bookstores, including 9 Books Inc. locations acquired in California. In other words, this was not the beginning of an entirely new strategy. Barnes& Nobles was promising to continue an expansion campaign pretty much already underway. Um, a smaller, more local, more curated chain. I mean, much of that turnaround has been associated with James Daunt's strategy, the CEO of Barnes and Nobles, for reinventing the chain entirely. The older Barnes and Noble model was heavily standardized. Stores often carried similar inventory, followed similar layouts, and sometimes felt as though the same corporate plan had been copied and pasted into every shopping center in America. It reminded me of the grocery store chains. Like everything's the same. There's nothing different about them. They're all same. But there were the big physical footprint for sure. Under Daunt, local booksellers have received more authority over their selections, display, recommendations, and the books that fit their communities. The goal is to make each location feel less like a warehouse with a coffee machine and more like an actual bookstore. Surprise, surprise. People like bookstores. Newer stores also tend to be smaller and more flexible than the enormous locations many of us remember from the 90s and early 2000s. Yeah, they were big. They were very big. Um, some are reportedly less than half the size of the traditional superstore format. A smaller footprint can be cheaper to operate, easier to place in modern retail developments, and simpler to curate. It also reduces the chances that you enter looking for one paperback and emerge 3 hours later from an unfamiliar corner of the second floor. Barnes and Nobles repeatedly expected its total American store count to reach approximately 740 by the end of 2026. So 702 minus 740 is 38, but they said 60. They closed down stores too, ladies and gentlemen, and they can repurpose them as well. So it's a new store in the same store. So we're going to count it if you follow that logic. And it's now time for a ceremonial coffee break. Please drink with me. And if you're a tea person, I'll allow it. You water people, though, no slack for you. Continuing on. But that brings us to one important clarification. Opening 60 stores does not necessarily mean Barnes & Nobles will add 60 stores to its net total. Some openings replace older stores, as I mentioned. Some are locations in newer or smaller spaces. Some mark the company's return to communities where a previous Barnes & Nobles closed. We're out, and they brought us back in. Meanwhile, other locations may shut down because the lease expires, landlords redevelop properties, or Barnes & Noble moves into a nearby shopping center. The claim should therefore be understood as roughly 60 grand openings, not necessarily 60 net new bookstores. Retailers enjoy announcing grand openings. Net change after relocations and closures rarely comes with balloons. I like balloons. We need more of them in our lives. So where are they now? The first Barnes and Noble opening of 2026 took place on January 21st in downtown Washington, D.C. That store returned Barnes and Nobles to the historic Woodward and Lothrop building on F Street. Haha, F Street. I like it. Near the company's former downtown location. It was followed by opening in Katy, Texas, and Strongville, Ohio on January 28th. So that's 3. Yay. The company continued opening stores across Florida, Illinois, Colorado, California, Washington, Virginia, Texas, Ohio, North Carolina, and Georgia. By March 4th, the new Colorado Springs location was identified by Barnes & Nobles as the 7th opening of the year. So 7, and we're in March at the time of me reading that. Or come the time of March, not me reading that. I take that back. 1 week later, a relocated Melbourne, Florida store became the 8th. Five more followed during April and May, including locations in Clovis, California, downtown Seattle, Arlington, Virginia, Prosper, Texas, and Aurora, Ohio. Three additional stores opened during June in Turlock, California, Lake Nona in Orlando, and Knightdale, North Carolina. Oak Park, Illinois opened on July 1st. Barnes& and Noble's then returned to Atlanta's Edgewood neighborhood on July 8th. So that was just a week and change ago, not too far back. So 18 open, 42 remain, if my math is correct. So based on the company's public available announcements, so 18 openings through July 8th. Because Barnes & Nobles has not released a public master spreadsheet, I would treat 18 as a carefully reconstructed count rather than an audited corporate total. A store could be missing. we opened one, guys, just we didn't tell anybody. Surprise. Maybe they are at 60 and they're just in weird, no newspaper online presence communities, which would be I would approve of that. I would actually like that Easter hunt for the opening Barnes and Nobles. Obviously, I'm amusing myself here and going off script, so let's get back on script. Yeah. But 18 does give us a reasonable picture, and that picture is not exactly sprinting ahead of schedule. 18 stores replaced Barnes and Nobles at only 30% of its 60 store target, even though more than half of the calendar year has passed. On a simple straight line schedule, the company should have been approaching 30 openings by the end of June. Instead, it appears to be roughly a dozen behind that pace. To reach 60 by December 31st, Barnes & Nobles would need to open approximately 42 additional stores during the remaining 24 weeks of the year. Coffee is needed. So now we're going to get into some fun math bits. That means averaging about 1.7 openings every week. During the first half of the year, it averaged closer to 2/3 of a store per week. Barnes & Nobles does not simply need to maintain its current speed, it needs to more than double it. At this point, the plan resembles someone who has written 3 pages of a 10-page paper and insists, I work better under pressure. Okay, you say so. Maybe, but December is coming, and December does not accept extensions. Yeah, that's right. Santa still comes every year, right on time. So, still, there are good reasons not to declare the target impossible. In June, Barnes & Noble said that 12 additional stores were expected to open by the end of the summer. In the same announcement, it repeated that more than 60 stores were still expected during 2026. So, yeah, that's pretty bold right there. Publicly identified upcoming locations including downtown Chicago, Chapel Hill, Orlando, Miami, San Antonio, Laredo, and several Georgia locations and additional stores in California. Barnes & Noble clearly has a substantial construction and leasing pipeline. The question is not whether more stores are coming. They are. The question is whether enough can be completed, inspected, staffed, stocked, and opened before December 31st. Signing the lease is one thing. Getting the shelves installed, permits approved, employees trained, books delivered, and cafe equipment working is something else entirely. A press release can open on schedule. A building occasionally has other ideas. So let's talk about independent bookstores and what kind of expansions means. Barnes & Noble's expansion rate is pretty much a larger question. What happened to independently owned bookstores when the largest physical bookseller in the United States begins opening around 60 locations every year? And I said physical because we're not including Bezos, Sky Daddy of Amazon in this. Grumble, grumble. And the answer's kind of complicated. Barnes & Noble's revival can be encouraging for the broader bookstore industry, while also, well, it does threaten individual stores. The effects are not necessarily the same for independent new bookstores and used bookstores. So, some of the benefits, I would say, the clearest positive is that Barnes& and Noble's expansion challenges the idea that physical bookstores are obsolete. For years, booksellers were told that Amazon, ebooks, audiobooks, and changing consumer habits would eventually eliminate the need for bookstores. Barnes& and Noble is now investing heavily in physical locations because it believes customers still want to browse shelves, talk to booksellers, attend events, drink coffee, and discover books in person. As a book person, I agree. Or at least stay in front of the new release table saying, I have heard that one. That confidence can benefit the entire industry. Independent bookstores have also experienced meaningful growth. In my Facebook feed, I see a new indie bookstore, new or used, open like maybe once or twice a week, sometimes more. I It's an explosion of bookstores. Now, the rate of other ones closing down, I'm not sure if it's a net positive or a net gain, but based off my feed, I would assume a net positive. So that's cool. Two thumbs up there. Um, Independent bookstores have also experienced meaningful growth. The American Bookseller Association reporting a 19% increase in membership during 2025. It also reported that hundreds of brick and mortar, mobile, and pop up bookstore businesses opened during the year, while a majority of member stores reported increased sales. So I think people are tired of getting burned online, or it's not what they thought it was because they can only tell so much from a picture. I mean, you can argue that the object is in a three-dimensional space, but it's a lot different in person, right? So, the American Bookseller Association reported the 19% increase, and it also reported that hundreds of brick and mortar, mobile, and pop-up bookstore businesses opened during the year. So, and just to give people an idea of that statement, there's a reason I repeated that, is the American Bookseller Association memberships sequentially reached little over 3,400, its highest level since the late 90s. So, way back yonder, when the internet was still in its infancy, we have now passed it in 2020 to 26. That is kind of impressive, actually. So Barnes and Noble's not necessarily expanding while independent bookstores disappear. At least nationally, both can grow at the same time. A new Barnes& and Noble may also introduce more people to the habit of visiting bookstores. Someone who starts by browsing bestsellers at Barnes& and Nobles may eventually seek out stronger local curation, specialty stores, used inventory, rare books, signed editions, or deeper expertise in a particular subject. Because there's only so much, for the most part, the typical Barnes and Noble clerk may know. And you want to know more about, I don't know, space opera sci-fi, but nobody in the entire store reads that stuff. Well, you're kind of out of luck. You need to go to Jim Bob down the street who loves that and can talk to you and recommend stuff all day. Good job, Jim Bob. You are appreciated. Um, so a few years later, you're pretty much inspecting a copyright 1973 page because you need to know where the book is a first printing. That's how it begins. There's also a one competitor of large chain independent stores share, and that is, well, the blasphemous name of Amazon. Amazon competes through uh, enormous inventory, aggressive pricing, fast delivery, and the ability to purchase a book at 2 in the morning without leaving the couch. Every new physical bookstore creates another alternative to that system. Barnes& Noble's purchase does not directly help a local independent bookstore, but the chain's expansions may help preserve a culture in which visiting bookstores remains normal. And that matters. Bookstores need customers who think of buying books as an activity, not merely a package arriving on the porch. I agree with that. And I kind of like the old guy or gal behind the counter who knows a thing or two about books. And if they ever say, I have something for you, and reach under the desk and give me a musty old tome, that's a dream come true for me. Um, and for the anyway, you can figure out the reference later. Anyway, continuing on. So, um, those are some of the positives. So let's talk about competitive risk for independent stores. The negative side is more immediate. A new Barnes& and Nobles can take sales directly from an existing independent bookstore, particularly when both rely on new releases, bestsellers, children's books, gifts, and general interest customers. If you've been to any bookstore lately, odds are they have more than just books to sell. Barnes& and Nobles has toys and puzzles and other weird tchotchke stuff. And I'm not saying tchotchke stuff is bad, but I come in for a book, not the tchotchke stuff, nor your fancy coffee, though I may get some of your fancy coffee. But that's notwithstanding. I come in to a bookstore to get a book. And this isn't just limited to Barnes and Nobles. I mean, we talked about stupid candles earlier. I'm sorry. I do not like the smell of candles in my bookstore. Please get rid of this. But maybe you come in for stationery or calligraphy. And I've seen stores that do knitting and stuff of this nature, and they sell these kind of supplies because they're appealing to their target audience locally. Nothing wrong with that. Like, if it keeps the lights on and they get this plus a book, I consider that a win. But I love it when a bookstore is just books, very peaceful, and I'm surrounded by books. Love books, not smelly candles. Moving on from my rant. A new Barnes& and Nobles can take sales directly from an existing independent bookstore, particularly when both rely on new releases. And we've seen this kind of recognized in Chicago already. The owner of the independent volume book cafe cited the arrival of a nearby Barnes& and Noble as a major factor in the deterioration of their business. And other local booksellers expressed concern as Barnes& and Noble's planned additional Chicago area locations. That does not prove every Barnes & and Noble damages every independent store. Volume had its own cost, location, business model, and other competitive pressures, but the risk is not theoretical. Independent bookstores typically operate on narrow, very, 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 very slim margins. Did I say very enough? I don't think I did. It is small. So for those listening that have aspirations, good luck to you. A large corporation can survive a disappointing quarter. A small bookstore may have trouble surviving a disappointing season. Barnes & Noble also possesses advantages that a single independent store cannot reproduce. It can spread cost across hundreds of locations. It has a national advertising, online ordering, a recognizable brand, an established membership program, and access to expensive retail developments. Most of your indie bookstore operators are not going to have these things, at least not at the start. And the company's new strategy may make that competition even stronger, because remember, they're moving off that grocery store model to, hey, let's appeal to our readership locally model. Barnes & Noble is giving individual locations greater authority over inventory, recommendations, and displays. That has improved the customer experience, but it also allows the chain to compete with independent bookstores on what were traditionally their greatest strengths. Barnes & Noble looked at the local curation model and essentially said, that appears to be working. We will have some of that, please. For customers, this may produce better chain bookstores. For independents, it removes one of their easiest points of differentiation. So if your Barnes & Nobles is Western themed and your bookstore is also Western themed, it's kind of hard to be different. There are also concerns about which books benefit. Some independent publishers have argued that Barnes & Noble's purchasing practices favor the largest corporate publishers and make meaningful placements difficult for smaller presses. Yes and no. This one's hard. It's hard when there's like 5 big publishers that produce the majority and have the majority of back catalogs from other smaller publishers that they absorbed over time. I mean, it really is hard. Independent bookstores frequently promote regional presses, local authors, translations, experimental literature, and specialized nonfiction that may not receive strong national support. And that's true, but it's very, very difficult to find an audience who is going to pick up something they've never heard it about unless they flip it over the back or the inside cover and read the excerpt. about what the book's kind of about and like, oh, that's cool. I believe the industry's advertising has a lot to do with that. I think it's a little better now with a lot of booktubers present to recommend actual things they've read or experienced, but marketing is what marketing is because that booktuber, unless they are on the experimental vein or such, it's hard to recommend what's not what I consider, well, pop culture books that's just in your Facebook feed. There's lots of books printed every year, and there's lots of independent publishers trying to crank them out as well. Again, another soapbox. I keep getting off of our topic. Back to Barnes& and Noble. Um, some independent publishers have argued that Barnes& and Noble's purchasing practice favor the largest corporate publishers, making meaningful placement difficult for smaller presses. I still say yes and no to this. I think they're also catching on that smaller presses with a cult following are a good idea. They're not stupid and they're not oblivious to this fact. They are. So that's probably going to be included in there as well at some point in their business model. Independent bookstores frequently promote regional presses. I'm sorry. More physical bookstores not automatically mean more opportunities for every kind of book. A bigger pie does not guarantee that everyone receives a larger slice. There's basically three different bookstore experiences. Used bookstores occupy on a somewhat different position. Barnes& Noble does not primarily compete in secondhand inventory. A customer looking for an inexpensive older edition or an out-of-print book, a collectible copy, or the unpredictable experience of digging through a secondhand shelves will not necessarily find an equivalent product of a Barnes& Noble. Yes, when I go to Barnes& Noble, they will look whatever I want on the computer screen. If I go to a used bookstore, unless the owner's there, maybe the clerk that's been there 10 years, they're going to know where everything is. But part of the fun is the treasure hunt of what's on this shelf that you've never dug through and finding things. Oh, they double wrote it. I've never seen this double row before. Is that on ever? It's a sense of wonderment, treasure hunt, never know what you're going to get bookstore that I personally enjoy from a used store versus a new store. I'm a little bit less enthusiastic. It's kind of like going to the hardware store. I'm going to get a box of screws. I'm going to get J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Unless it's that kind of mission, I'm in and out. I'm not going to spend I'm not going to spend hours in a new bookstore. Now, the trendy pop book reader who wants the latest thing, they're going to spend hours looking for that perfect, pristine-ish copy or best condition one they can get. No corner dings, no cover creases, no folds, none of that nonsense. But good to them. They're just a different type of book buyer than I am. So, yeah. So another thing about used bookstores, they may not know it has something until you discover it behind, I don't know, 1986 gardening encyclopedia. Like, oh, here's this super rare book that they put back up before that 1986 gardening encyclopedia got there. That unpredictability is part of the appeal. Used bookstores can differentiate themselves through collectible editions, lower cost reading copies, trade credit, estate collections, local history, signed books, unusual subjects, and titles that have disappeared from ordinary retail distribution. For that reason, a specialized used bookstore is generally less vulnerable than an independent store selling many of the same new books as Barnes & Nobles. That is so true. If you want to survive, my opinion, don't sell what Barnes & Noble sells. Don't sell what Amazon sells. Sell everything else than that. And I think you're going to do all right as long as you market yourself that way. And there's a buyer market for it. So if you can have all the weird stuff and oddities, but if your local audience isn't into that, they're not going to buy it. So you need to narrow the scope with that kind of caveat in mind. So other thing is both stores still compete for customers' time and discretionary book budget. Barnes & Noble also sells gifts, records, games, exclusive editions, clearance books, toys, and coffee. it can function as an entire leisure destination. If customers spend $60, they may have $60 less to spend at a used bookstore. Or according to book buyer mathematics, they may spend another $60 anyway and act shocked when the credit card statement arrives. The strongest defense for a used bookstore is therefore not to imitate Barnes& and Nobles, it is to become more distinctly itself. A used bookstore should offer that kind of experience national chain cannot reproduce. Unpredictable inventory, local personality, deep knowledge. You got to know what you're talking about, in my opinion, if you're going to run a used bookstore and sell the weird stuff that you're going to sell. Unusual books in the sense that the next shelf may contain something you did not know existed. So let's talk about the balance of all these fun things. Um, so is Barnes& and Noble expansion good or bad for the independent bookstores? Let's have a coffee break and think about that. Is it good or bad? Well, nationally, there appears to be room for Barnes& and Nobles and independent stores to grow at the same time. Locally, the answer depends on the market. Yes, the market's going to dictate whether you live or die. A Barnes and Noble entering community with no bookstore may expand the audience for physical books. A Barnes and Noble opening near a vulnerable new book independent may divide an already limited customer base. You're splitting the market. You're splitting the dollars. Nobody likes splitting dollars. Um, let's see. A location opening near a highly specialized rare or genre bookstore, like an all romance bookstore, or an all sci-fi or sci-fi fantasy bookstore, may create less direct inventory competition, although the stores still compete for attention and spending. Yes, there's X amount of readers in your town, but if you're the sci-fi fantasy bookstore and Barnes Nobles has sci-fi, probably newer sci-fi, and that's going to split your customer dollars to an extent, but Barnes& Nobles also carries everything else that other bookstore would never see anyway. So I think both can cohabitate even if they were set up right next to each other. My own view is that Barnes& Noble's revival is positive for the broader culture of physical book selling, but that does not make every individual opening automatically good for every bookseller, meaning the indies or the used or the rare or the bizarre. There is nothing wrong with shopping at Barnes& Nobles. It offers broad selection, convenient locations, long hours, cafes, and access to books to communities with few alternatives. But if readers also want independent bookstores, used bookstores, and specialist shops, those businesses require deliberate support, meaning you and me. They cannot pay rent with fond memories. You can have the best time there, but if you never go back, it's going to die. It's up to you, my book reading friends, to support your local indie and used bookstores. 5-star reviews help, or saying, I really need to stop in there. Instead of someone saying, I really need to stop in there sometime, you need to talk up your locals and your used and your indie bookstores. They survive when people actually purchase books from them, not from a friendly conversation. If you go in my opinion, it's polite to at least buy one book. You can give it away. You could, I don't know, give the homeless man a book. Don't care. Support local. If you go in, it's polite to at least buy one book. And Barnes Noble's expansion is therefore about more than whether the company can complete 60 openings, also about what kind of book selling landscape those openings will help create. So, will Barnes Nobles reach their 60? They're gonna be tight, I'll say that. So, will it pull it off? My answer is that the company is clearly behind pace, but reaching its goal remains slightly more likely than missing it. I would put probability at around 2 chances in 3. The strongest argument against Barnes& Nobles is basic mathematics. If approximately 18 stores have opened, the company still needs around 42. Even if the 12 promised summer locations all open on time, Barnes& and Nobles could enter the fall with roughly 30 completed and another 30 needed during the final 3 months. That required an extremely active fourth quarter. It would also leave little room for construction delays, permit problems, inspection issues, late fixtures, staffing difficulties, or any of the other things that can push a December opening into January. Barnes& and Noble only needs several projects to slip before 60 becomes, I don't know, 57. The difference between success and failure could be a few delayed fire inspections and one shipment of bookshelves stuck somewhere in Ohio. Ohio? Why are you being mean like that? Um, Barnes& and Nobles has done this before. That's probably the strongest argument in the company's favor. Its opening schedule is not evenly distributed throughout the year. In November 2025 alone, Barnes& and Noble scheduled 14 grand openings and ultimately reported more than 60 for the year. A similar pattern occurred in 2024 when the company planned 12 openings during November. A straight line calculation may therefore be, well, misleading. Barnes& Nobles can open 2 or 3 stores during a slower month and open 10 or 14 during a concentrated late year push. Retailers have a powerful reason to finish the stores during the fall. They want them open before the holiday shopping season because big bucks during quarter four. Nothing motivates a construction schedule quite like the possibility of selling gift cards in December. Barnes& and Noble also continues to reaffirm the target. They're saying, yeah, we're on track. As recently as June, the company was still saying that more than 60 stores were expected in 2026. It could have softened the language to dozens of locations, approximately 50 or up to 60. They didn't do that. That's just the company believes enough projects are already leased or under construction to make the goal achievable. The way Barnes & Noble counts openings also works in its favor. A relocated store can count as a grand opening even if it replaces another location nearby. The Melbourne store was a relocation. Clarendon was described as a grand opening. The upcoming Farmington store is moving from an older location into West Farms Mall. These projects still require construction, staffing, inventory, and approval, but Barnes & Nobles may already have local employees, management, construction, customers, and market knowledge in place. It is less like starting bookstores from nothing and more like moving one while not trying to lose the bookmarks, the staff, or the mystery section. It can be done. So here is my final prediction from just knowing what they've done historically in the past. I expect Barnes & Noble to finish somewhere between 55 and 65 grand openings. So if I had to pick a number, 61 sounds good. That would allow the company to say it filled its promise, although the net increase in total stores will likely be smaller because of relocations and closures. If Barnes & Noble's misses, I do not expect a dramatic failure. The most likely scenario would be several December openings slipping into January 2027 and leaving the company just short. That would be a technical miss rather than a collapse of the expansion strategy. They're still going to open these stores, guys. It would be the retail equivalent of arriving at the building on time, but spending 10 minutes trying to find the entrance. Regardless whether the final number is 57, 60, 63, the fact that they're opening this many stores is remarkable, and they've done it before. I mean, only a few years ago, Barnes & Noble had fallen below 600 locations. There's 600, they are 700 and rising currently. So by July 2026, the company said it had reached more than 700 stores, with one announcement placing the total at 712 before the subsequent Atlanta opening. The largest bookstore chain in the United States is no longer primarily closing stores, it is opening them, and that's fantastic. That expansion could normalize physical book buying and bring bookstores communities that have gone without them. It could also create serious competition for independent booksellers already operating on thin margins. Both things can be true at the same time. The final test will occur during October, November, and December, Q4 of this year. That is when we'll learn whether Barnes & Noble's comeback can move quickly enough to deliver one of the most ambitious retail expansions promised in 2026. So, I want to know what you think. Will Barnes& and Noble's reach 60 openings by December 31st? And is expansions ultimately good for the larger book selling world? Let me know down in the comments. I really want to know what your thoughts here because some people are anti Barnes& and Nobles, and I get it. I'm very pro support local, but I'm not opposed to going to a Barnes& and Nobles to get something that's not going to be at the bookstores I shop at the used stores at least, or shouldn't be. How they got it, I have several questions if they do. But anyway, let me know that down in the comments. Will they make it? What do you think? How will this impact the larger book selling world or book buying world at large? And is it good or bad for independent and used bookstores? And let's go ahead and stop the screen share here. So, if you like what I'm doing, have a public Discord, come talk about books in there. It is free for one and all. If you want to join an awesome book club with awesome people reading awesome books, there's a link from Patreon down there. Love to have you with us. And if you're an audiobook person, we do have that option as well, even though I would say our group's split between audiobook and physical book readers, but we're all talking about the same book, and we make sure that they both work together. And I don't think anybody's doing both at the same time. I could be wrong on that. I don't think I've ever asked that question to them, but maybe they do. So, and there'll be more book clubs coming in October. You can watch my previous video on that, mentioning that. So that'll be kind of cool, expanding the world of book reading and horizons thereof. I think that's going to do it for today. I know it was long, and I got off track. I couldn't help myself. I'm a bad person, I know, but I don't care. It's my channel. I do what I want. And with that being said, as always, keep on booking on.